Stand Watie, Cherokee Nation, early 1800s. And again, I realize some of y'all, this is old hat to. But if you're like me, you get to a certain age, you can watch a TV series, and then it's great because a month later you can watch it again. And you can enjoy it over and over again because you don't remember for what happened a month before. So maybe if you already knew all of this, you forgot some of it, and it'll be a reminder tonight. But yeah, the Cherokees were forced west. They came from this roughly 6-state area where they were concentrated on the great, as we call them in our book, the Trails of Tears. There were multiple trails with multiple tribes, and I find that it's amazing who didn't even know that there was, the common understanding of the Trail of Tears was just that one big Indian tribe all came together. That one Indian tribe. Well, of course, there were many, and it took place over many, many decades. The stories were many different ones, but that's where the Cherokees came from. And the man we're revering tonight, Stand Watie, I think most appropriately his Cherokee name was Dagadoga, which meant he stands on 2 feet. That don't sound like what he did his entire life. He stood on 2 feet. Born near Rome, Georgia, 1806. Unfortunately, that was right in the middle of a big gold rush in the late 1820s. One of the big reasons why the Cherokees were forced out. And we talk about this whole story, by the way, in depth through multiple chapters in Volume 1 of the Oklahomans. Elias Boudinot, Buck Watie, Stand Watie's. I mean, if I could say who was the greatest Oklahoman ever to live, it might have been this guy. This guy, and he only lived here, a few weeks before the Ross Party people murdered him. But he was Stand Watie's older brother. This was a 3/4 Cherokee man who studied at the Cornwall Foreign Mission School in Yankee Puritan, Connecticut, and then matriculated to Andover College, which unfortunately became one day Yale. Oh, how the mighty have fallen, Ichabod, right? But back in the day, this was incredible. He also managed to snare one of the most beautiful blonde-headed Puritan girls in New England. Was that not a scandal? That was a huge scandal. So I've actually got a talk just on that romance. I call it what do I call it? Something Romeo and Juliet, but the Cherokee and Puritan Romeo and Juliet. It is an incredible story. We'll talk about that another time. That was Stand Watie's remarkable older brother, who during these times, 1820s, 30s, was much better known person than him. The famous, I mentioned Elias Boudinot. Well, this can be a snare for Oklahoma history teachers. There were not one, not two, but 3 Elias Boudinots, or Boudinots, whatever the pronunciation was. This was the first one. And by the way, Elias Boudinot was the name that Stand Watie's older brother, Buck Watie, took to himself, as they would do back then, in honor of his patron, of his mentor. You say, well, who was the original Elias Boudinot? Well, there's a little bit of a resume on him. He just did things like be a colonel in the Continental Army, was president of Congress, 1782 and 83. They go, when was that? Well, yeah, that was the first Continental Congress. So he was technically the first president of the United States. He was president of the Continental Congress when we signed the treaty with Britain for our own independence. And there's a lot of other, first president of the American Bible Society, and a very close friend of George Washington, who appointed him to, I don't recall all the offices that were on that list. A very great American man. And then the third Elias Boudinot, I won't talk about him in depth tonight, but that was actually Stand Watie's nephew, who became a Confederate officer and served in the Confederate Congress for Cherokee Nation, thank you. And then was probably the lead boomer afterwards, after the war, of gaining American settlement out here into these lands. But Stand Watie, a remarkable young man, by age 21 had his law license, clerk of the Cherokee Nation's Supreme Court at age 21, and a leader in the Cherokee Golden Age. And some of you all may recall that the golden age of the Cherokees was between the conflicts of the 1830s and the Trails of Tears. I didn't really get into it in depth, but that great divide among the Cherokees as to whether to come out and come on to the Indian Territory or not. And the Waties, of course, were on the side that I would consider the visionary, the wise, far-seeing side, that our tribe is gradually being ruined here in the southeast. And we're being overrun by American population. Whiskey peddlers, a large part of the tribe was falling victim to that. So they said for the survival of our tribe, we need to go out. And that was Thomas Jefferson's original vision too, by the way, was in compassion for the natives to set up an enclave for them to come where they would not be, in Jefferson's view, and in the Waties, ruined by our culture. But Stand Watie, as a young man, was educated. This comes from, I'm sure some of y'all have read The Red Fox, Wilfred Knight's just vibrant chronicle of Stand Watie's campaigns during the war between the states. Early influence, Wilfred Knight chronicles the Moravian Mission School educational training during his formative period imbued him with strong spiritual qualities. His letters and correspondence talking about Stand Watie were occasionally reflective of his biblical knowledge, and he joined the Moravian Church while still in school. So that was the Baptist and Presbyterian missionaries and Moravians that were impacting these tribes early on. And of course, they're considered persona non grata and politically incorrect and everything else today. But one of the reasons we had some of the great Oklahomans rise up that have native blood but have been Christian men and women goes all the way back to those selfless missionaries in the early 1800s. Of course, this was a time of great accomplishment for the Cherokee tribe. Sequoyah, George Guess, half Cherokee, half Scot, writer of the Cherokee syllabary. That was a 12-year process. He was mocked and scorned. It was kind of like you picture almost Job and his counselors, mocking him and saying, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing this? Well, when it came out, all of a sudden he was a hero to everybody. They also created the first Aboriginal or Native publication in North America, the Cherokee Phoenix. And some of y'all may know you can find original copies of these in the great repository at the History Center downstairs. They have these original issues themselves. 1828 Cherokee Phoenix. Elias Boudinot and the tribal principal chief John Ross were co-editors of that. I'm sorry, in the beginning it was Elias Boudinot and the Presbyterian missionary Samuel Worcester. Worcester was actually the founder, and then Boudinot was the editor, if you will. Anybody remember anything special about how they laid out their columns in that newspaper? Alternating Cherokee and English language. They wanted it to be informative, but also an outreach. They didn't want to leave out a lot of the full-bloods, for instance, that were really not wanting to embrace Christianity, free market, land ownership, those sorts of things. So they made sure that everybody could read it. Elias Boudinot became a thundering champion in his day for his people on a lot of fronts. Not the least of these were the alcohol issue. You were hearing about prohibition a while ago. This is some of what he said as he saw the devastation that was being wreaked on the tribes, in particular his own tribe. And I feel like I can speak somewhat freely with a great-grandfather named O'Dwyer. We've had the same history in my heritage, the Irish, that alcohol has been the rack and ruin. I mean, in our own family, from one end of it to the other. The only question is, it wasn't did you have trouble with alcohol, the question was did you escape it in time to make something of your life? And I'm one of the fortunate ones that did, but there are others that didn't. Elias Boudinot said, speaking truth to power in his day, white and red power, intemperance is the curse of mankind, that is, drinking alcoholic spirits. It spreads desolation in societies and families. It's the parent of strife, the cause of diseases, and almost every species of misery. It has been our shame, the Indians, in the eyes of other people, and has planted the common opinion that the love of whiskey is a necessary trait of the Indians' character. Think that got some people upset in the Cherokee leadership? It did. Anyway, there's other great quotes here that go on. And I won't read those, but that is in volume 1 of the Oklahomans. Well, Principal Chief John Ross, who held that office for 42 years, he was the great, powerful leader of the Cherokees for that century. He and Elias Boudinot and the entire what came to be known as the Treaty Party, that is the group that said let's sign the treaty and move the tribe west, as opposed to the Ross Party, which was no, let's dissemble and delay and pontificate and see if we can outlast one presidential administration after another and just stay here forever. So they started out as good friends, but they became mortal enemies. Chief John Ross. Well, Treaty Party leaders defied Ross and signed the 1835 New Echota Treaty, and of course Stand Watie was one of the leaders of the Treaty Party, along with Elias Boudinot, his older brother, Major and John Ridge, uncle and cousin. Its provisions included the Cherokees moving to Indian Territory and the paying of $5 million to the Cherokees. That's a lot of money back then. Travel expenses and temporary annuities. And so we have these memories of what a horrible travel and trek it was, which it was, on the main Trails of Tears. But the Treaty Party left in an organized fashion at a decent time of the year weather-wise, and they were able to get out here. You don't hear horror stories about the pilgrimage to Indian Territory about the Treaty Party. Those come later when, unfortunately, those that remained and refused to leave were indeed violently uprooted from their homes, yanked up from their dinner tables, hauled in from the fields where they were plowing, put into prison camps, in effect, for days or weeks, and then eventually brought out no matter what the time of the year was, with poor food, poor doctrine, and a lot of people died en route, including John Ross's own wife. It was a tragedy. So the Treaty Party leaders have since come into scorn because of being accused of being sellouts, being white man's lackeys, all the familiar types of accusations, should I say it, from liberal academia. My view, far from personally profiting from any of his treaty dealings, as he was accused of then and since, poverty so beset both, Elias Boudinot in particular, that he had to borrow funds from Samuel Worcester just to build a modest home in Indian Territory. So I'm talking somewhat at length tonight about Stand Watie's family, not just about his battle campaigns, but who he was, the people he came from and was around as he grew up. This is actually a picture that none other than Steve Bias got for me. The homemade knife used in the killing of Elias Boudinot by Ross Party fellow Cherokees who murdered him. What we don't have is a picture of the tomahawk they stuck in the back of his head, which they did. It was about 12 on 1, and they attacked him from behind. Well, moving forward, there was that Cherokee golden age from roughly 1840 to 1861, and that was the period after which the competing factions reconciled, and Stand Watie was, in my opinion, the leader of that. He had his own brother, cousin, and uncle murdered by the other faction. But he reached out the arm of reconciliation to John Ross in 1846, so I guess it was really the mid-1840s to 1860. And the tribe largely came together, at least for a period of time. But came such time, 1861, in which the Cherokees issued their own Declaration of Independence from the United States. And I like to remember this because it shows the reasons that they, in their minds, seceded and why they went with the Confederacy as a tribe. The Declaration, how back then, all the titles were real long, right? They weren't picky. They weren't worried with one word and two word catchy titles. Their title for that document was Declaration by the People of the Cherokee Nation of the causes which have impelled them to unite their fortunes with those of the Confederate States of America. That was the title of the document. And then within the document, they state, this was the Cherokees in 1861 at the outset of the war when they decided to go with the South as a tribe. Providence rules the destinies of nations and events by inexorable necessity. Overrules human resolutions. In the states which still adhered to the Union, a military despotism has displaced the civil power, and the laws became silent amid arms. Free speech and almost free thought became a crime.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. I didn't even have to say it, did I?
Nope.
Wow. Free speech and almost free thought became a crime, right? And that's what they saw as they looked at, well, let me continue. The mandate of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States was set at naught by the military power, the Union Army. And this outrage on common right, approved by a president, Abraham Lincoln, sworn to support the Constitution. Didn't want to offend anybody might be listening in the next room. So the Cherokee saw what was happening in Missouri, where an army was called out to bloodily put down people that did not want to be part of the United States at that point in St. Louis and elsewhere, in Kentucky, in Maryland, bloody pogroms in Baltimore, a throwing in prison of the Maryland legislature, Delaware, and what became West Virginia. So they had a lot of reasons, and the main reasons weren't slavery, by the way, because the Cherokees that went with the North and the other tribes, they took their slaves with them when they went north. So, like we said in our book, The War Between the States, a lot of people had a lot of different reasons for fighting that war. Well, of course, this is one of the many things that I don't remember from Oklahoma history in 9th grade. It's possible Steve Bias was distracting me, acting up like he often did. It's possible. It's possible it wasn't taught as well by our basketball coach, who also taught us how to drive 6-hour drivers. I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads around the room on that one. But yeah, the Civil War happened in Oklahoma. Okay, here's just a partial list of skirmishes, fights, ambushes, battles. Some years ago I went to the reenactment of the Second Battle of Cabin Creek. And it was cool. There was twice as many guys in the reenactment as were actually in the battle. That was cool. Of course, in the western side, and we break our War Between the States book into, we go year by year, 61, 62, 63. We have 61 in the west, 61 in the east, and back and forth. Because, there were two major theaters, and there was overlap and all, but that helps make it, I think, more digestible for the average reader. Well, the Western Theater launched with the Battle of Wilson's Creek, same day as First Manassas in the east in Virginia, August of 1861. Stand Watie wasn't actually there. There were a bunch of Cherokees that were, but here's a partial list of some of the people that were. Yeah, Frank James, Jesse James' older brother, Wild Bill Hickok, Cole Younger, the younger brothers, William Quantrell, Quantrell's Raiders, Ben McCullough, one of the greatest Texas Rangers to ever live. He was 50 years old with white hair flowing down over his shoulders as a colonel at that battle. Bell's Star, and 30 soldiers who eventually became Union generals. So this was a fight of large magnitude as far as its impact. For one thing, it convinced a lot of people the Confederacy could win the war. Nobody had thought, especially when coupled with what happened, First Manassas, First Bull Run the same day. That's the battle that made Stonewall Jackson famous. In fact, that's the battle that gave him the name Stonewall. He didn't have it till the last 2 years of his life. But that's another reason that cemented the tribal affiliation with the Confederates, because they thought, wow, we are not necessarily backing a loser here. And then the following on that, the latter months of 1861, which was the first year of the war, there was a harsh campaign in which the Southern Confederates, that was comprised both of natives as well as Confederate regulars from Texas and Arkansas, drove the Union Indians out of Oklahoma up into Kansas. And I say harsh, it was the main battles were happening up around Tulsa in December up through the Christmas season. So once again, when people cry and wail and moan about, oh, whatever's happening today, and there's a lot of stuff that I have a difference with happening today, it ain't like that. We're all going to be warm and probably with people we love and having lots of good food over Christmas, and that's kind of what it looked like for them in 1861. Well, as the Western Theater progressed, this battle that was in northwest Arkansas, and as with so many battles, the Confederates called it one thing and the Union called it another. So the Yankees called it Pea Ridge, the Confederates called it ELKHORN Tavern. It was in Arkansas, but it was basically a fight for control of Missouri. And the North won that battle, partly because, yes sir?
March.
Was it March? Thank you. Sweetie, will you make a note of that? Hey, there was probably more mistakes in this before the last time I spoke.
So I know it wasn't me.
What's that?
There was snow on the ground.
Snow on the ground, yeah. Okay.
Just a young lieutenant.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Well, and part of why I show this is even though the Confederates lost that battle, largely because they lost kind of their A-team of leadership. It was like the first stringers all got killed. The aforementioned Ben McCullough and others. Stand Watie and the Cherokees, Stand Watie was on the field for this battle, and they distinguished themselves mightily, not least of which was, well, here's a description, was counterattacking on a section of the field, the advancing Federals, capturing one of their cannon and turning it on them as they fled. And here's an eyewitness report from one of Watie's troopers. With Stand Watie's troops dismounted and John Drew's men still in their saddles, the two Cherokee regiments swept forward, along with part of the 9th Texas Cavalry, and the bearded, wild-eyed Texans matched strides through the brush with Watie's warriors, brandishing shotguns, rifles, tomahawks, knives, and bows and arrows. The Indians charged with wild shrieks and war cries and hit Oosterhouse's Federal cavalry regulars even before he had a chance to pull his flying artillery back. That was Wilfred Knight's description of the battle in Red Fox. That's a famous Kurtz and Allison painting. Some of y'all may have this. Somewhat inaccurately, no doubt, showing the Cherokees in buckskin and fringe, but nonetheless, it does show the Cherokees are right in the middle of it, right in the front, charging the Union cannon. Yeah, I was hoping that I didn't leave this quote out. This is from one of Watie's mounted troopers recalling what it was like at that battle. I don't know how he did it, but Watie gave the order which he always led, and his men could follow him into the very jaws of death. The Indian rebel yell was given, and we fought like tigers 3-1. It must have been that mysterious power of Stand Watie that led us on to make the capture against such odds. I love that, the mysterious power of Stand Watie. Well, one of his troopers that day became a judge later in Pryor, Oklahoma, James Keyes, and his remembrance was, quote, I regard General Stand Watie as one of the bravest and most capable men and the foremost soldier ever produced by the North American Indians. He was wise in counsel and courageous in action. So this was no hot-headed, temperamental firebrand. And one of the reasons he was so successful was that was one of his cavalry scouts, Clem Rogers, father of Will Rogers. In fact, if you've been to Will Rogers' birthplace up on Oologah Lake, there's a little plaque there that talks about how this is where his grandfather, James Rogers, was murdered by the Ross Party in 1842 during that Cherokee Civil War. And of course this, well, get ahead of myself. Stand Watie, this was a man who had great personal suffering. Gosh, I look at his losses in life and, I just cringe. He had 3 sons. This was one of them, Comiskey Watie, who died, during the war. I mentioned a few moments ago that the federal Indians were driven up into Kansas. Well, that wasn't just the warriors. That was their women, their children, their dependents. Meanwhile, the pro-Confederates were driven down into the North Texas Red River Valley country. And they didn't just come back during summer or vacations. They were down there. They were out there in the elements. And we're talking maybe, 20, 30,000 people were down there, just the Confederates. And many died, among which were Stand Watie's son, Comiskey, and his wife, Sarah Bell Watie's sister died during that time. So that's his, talk about a great woman. I mean, that's all I can say. Sarah Bell Watie. His affectionate term for her was Sally. And again, you're fighting for your life amidst your own homeland. Stand Watie's own house was burned down by the enemy. Then you're worried every minute of the day, what's happening to my family, freezing to death out there in the open. And literally, in Watie's case, one son did, his wife's sister did. But this was quite a woman. This battle had gotten, as most of you know, this fight out here, very brutal. Have any of y'all seen the movie Ride with the Devil? Tremendous film. Came out 1999, 2000. A story of the fight out here. It was based in southern Missouri. It's kind of an outlaw Josie Wales type film. Tobey Maguire and others. And it showed, I think, powerfully how that went from being almost like a fraternity match between people that had different views, almost like a sporting deal, to the most pitiable, brutal, animalistic, not just fight for survival, but something that was driven by a primal hate. When you would see loved ones murdered in their own homes and outside their houses, as happened. And so this is what really happened. This was truly brother against brother out here. And Sarah Watie had heard a horrible story that another of their sons, Saladin, who was a decorated combat soldier and officer, had been involved with another young Cherokee man in the murder of a Union prisoner. So somehow this came to her, and she wrote to her husband, Stand Watie. And have any of y'all seen the book Cherokee Cavaliers? Well, Edward Everett Dale and Gaston Lytton. Edward Everett Dale, any of y'all that attended OU suffered through some classes in Dale Hall. There's a lot of the freshman courses, stupid stuff, philosophy, sociology. Come on, move back. My wife's saying get out of the way. I think it is. Oh, this?
Just push it, Chuck. Yeah.
But anyway, Dale Hall, the central building at OU, and the Dale Hall Tower behind it, where many of the professors' offices were named after Edward Everett Dale. And he collected this memorable series of over 200 letters written between some of the valorous names from Cherokee history. If you haven't read that book, I encourage you to get it. You read in their own words their correspondence between one another. Many of the people we've mentioned already. Well, Sarah Watie wrote to Stand Watie when she heard this story that one of their sons had perhaps been involved in murdering a prisoner. Tell my boys to always show mercy as they expect to find God merciful to them. I do hate to hear such things. It almost makes me crazy to hear such things. I find myself almost dead sometimes thinking about it. Right, moms? Thinking about your precious boy, if you think he's become a brutal murderer or something like that. If you should ever catch William Ross, who is the anti-treaty party, that's the pro-Ross party, son-in-law of Cherokee Principal John Ross, if you should ever catch William Ross, she points him out in particular. I think there's reason to believe he's probably one of the ringleaders of some of the brutal stuff that the federal Cherokees were doing to the Confederate ones. Don't have him killed. I know how bad his mother would feel, but keep him till the war is over. I know they all deserve death, so she wasn't shortchanging what had been happening. But I do feel for his old mother, and then I want them to know that you do not want to kill them just to get them out of your way. Well, there came a time, first of all, his response to that, which is in Cherokee Cavaliers, very personal, writing to his wife, this is the words of Stand Watie, "It seems as my doom. Let me act as I will. My conduct is always considered wrong. No charity was ever shown me, yet I have lived through, and if it would be supposed that I became hardened and would be reckless, but it still hurts my feelings. I am not a murderer. It still hurts my feelings. I call upon God to judge me. He knows that I love my friends and above all my wife and children. The opinion of the world to contrary notwithstanding." The words of Stand Watie to us through the years. Well, some of you may know that there came a time when Stand Watie and the Cherokee Mounted Rifles thundered into Tahlequah, the capital of the Cherokee Nation, which had been captured by the Federals, and at least temporarily took it back from him and captured a young William Ross. And the good news is, Stand Watie not only allowed him to survive, but he grew up to be the principal chief of the Cherokees after the war. So he did a wise thing, right, guys? He listened to his wife. Okay, 5 more minutes and then we'll be done. Y'all are probably well versed on his great exploits, the capture of the J.R. Williams, the Union gunboat in the Arkansas River, which painting hangs outside the executive director's office in the Oklahoma History Center. The Second Battle of Cabin Creek, we mentioned that earlier. That was a spectacular middle of the night ambush of a Union, 300 strong Union wagon train that was in the process of supplying the entire Union force in Indian Territory and probably Texas beyond that. And Watie and Richard Gannot, Texas Cavalry colonel, they ambushed it and captured it all. And what they were able to do with that, it was worth tens of millions of dollars in modern day currency. It clothed the entire Confederate Army in Indian Territory, fed every Confederate soldier and civilian, all those people down in Red River Valley for over a month, forestalled the strategic Union advance, and the entire brigade re-enlisted. And those of you that are observers, that was a big problem, right? Especially if it was hard and you might not win, you just lose your guys. Well, having them sign back on, that's like these college football teams getting a guy to come back and not go to the NFL. I know we're kind of laughing. It's pitiful comparison, but maybe a somewhat modern comparison. It's also when Stand Watie was promoted to Brigadier General because of that exploit. And by the way, there was one other thing I wanted to say about that. We say this in Volume 1. We have a 31-page chapter on the war in Indian Territory in Volume 1 of the Oklahomans. We call it Uncivil War, by the way. But I concluded after a lot of years of study, as a lot of y'all have done, that the Indian Territory campaign was a tactical victory for the Federals, but a strategic victory for the Confederates. The Federals held a lot of the land. They kind of went where they wanted to win, and then they had to retreat back because of Watie and his guerrillas. But what they wanted was to use it as a launching pad to invade Texas from the back door and then move away. And they never did that. They got as far as Middle Boggy and a bloody massacre that involved slitting the throats of outnumbered Confederates. But then they turn around and Watie and the Cherokee Mounted Rifles and the Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, Seminoles, Caddos, and Osages that fought with them. Yeah, they'd stolen so many Union horses from in and around Fort Gibson that General James Blunt, who was a very good civilian military general, his entire force of cavalry they became infantry. They had no horses to ride. So they just couldn't get down to the Red River because they would be cut off and have no food and lose their horses and be ambushed and bled by 1,000 cuts. Last Confederate general surrender, the old Choctaw country down the Kiamichi Mountains came in. They chased him all over the West. Union armies from every direction. Most of the northern states involved and many of the tribal members, they never caught him. He came out because of what was happening to the civilians, their suffering. If it had been up to him, he'd have kept fighting. And one of the sad things, we talked about the suffering of his life, was Stand Watie died, I think in 1867, 2 years after the war. This son, who I think was most like Stan of the three, he's a quiet, contemplative boy, very smart, very gentle spirit. It's hard to read this without getting choked up, and I rendered it as he wrote it in his own letter. This is in Cherokee Cavaliers. I feel proud to think I have a papa that takes the last dollar he has to send me to school. After the war, when they were devastated, the house had been burned down. And yeah, Stand Watie, this will tell you his situation after the war. He's already had 2 sons die. He wrote this, and this is in Cherokee Cavaliers, to his daughter, one of his 2 daughters, Jacqueline, in 1871. Dads and granddads, see if this hits a chord with you when you think about your beloveds. You cannot imagine how lonely I am up here at our old place. It's where they lived before the war, the happiest years of his life with his family. Without any of my dear children being with me, I would be so happy to have you here, but you must go to school. That's what he wrote. He had sent his 2 daughters in Watica to school in the post-war America to help them to get ahead. Well, in closing here, a few quotes. Mabel Anderson, who early on wrote The Life of General Stand Watie. Some of y'all may know she interviewed many of his troopers. This was early 1900s, eyewitness accounts. And her take on the Indian Territory campaign was that Sherman's terrible raid on a smaller scale might have been repeated in the Indian Territory and Texas had it not been for General Watie and his command. His brigade was like a stone wall between Texas and the foe. Edward Everett Dale, you mentioned earlier, who I salute, the great Oklahoma historian, an old cowboy in the old Greer County that was Texas until they figured out that it was our land because the Red River was south of it, not north. When this Cherokee Cavaliers book I keep referring to, he dedicated it as follows. There are a lot of people he could have dedicated it to, a lot of great Cherokees in that book, but he wrote to one. To the memory of General Stand Watie, patriot, soldier, and statesman, this volume is reverently dedicated. Well, my final quote here. This was a letter that was written, this is not in Cherokee Cavaliers, I found this elsewhere, from a Mrs. Hardcastle, who I believe was a white woman, Southerner. She wrote this to Sarah Bell Watie after his passing. She wrote, I read with sadness of the death of your much esteemed husband. My tenderest sympathy is yours. I trust you have consolation from a higher power than earthly friends for the loss of one so dear to you. And I think these words we all need to remember. We need to have these pulsing through our blood veins as we live our lives in this time when our country needs us. Our God doesn't need us, but our God is pleased if we serve Him, and our country most definitely needs us. Our children, our young people need to see us standing up, not foolishly, but wise as serpents, harmless as dove, as Jesus Himself said, in standing up to oppose the villainy and the wickedness across our land in this day and time. So I think these are words for us to remember as we get weary, as we get worn out, as we have our aches and pains. His labors, Stand Watie's labors on earth, have not been in vain. He was on the losing side in the Ross Treaty Party. He was on the losing side to have to go on the Trail of Tears anyway. He was on the losing side in the war. He was on the losing side after the war when the business enterprises he wanted to do, treaty party foes shut down and used the government where he could not proceed with business endeavors. See, wow, that guy lost in so many ways. Well, no, his labors have not been in vain. He has done much lasting good for his country and countrymen that will never be forgotten, but handed down to the future generations in the book of history for them to follow in his footsteps and aspire to leave their footprints on the sands of time as well as he. And I would say that postage stamp 1995 even had his name on school buildings until they took it off recently. Yeah, well, it was on there a long time. And guess what? We're all sitting here talking about Stand Watie tonight, not who the brutes were that he fought against, right? And I have influenced a lot of young people, and I hope I get to influence a whole bunch more. And people like Stand Watie, they know who he is, they know who Sarah Bell Watie was, and they know why they are worthy of being remembered. So God will write the final chapters. He always does. We need to remember that in our time. I believe our greatest works, our greatest influence may happen after we're gone. Look at Stand Watie. When he was dying as he did alone on the old place up on the Grand River, I wonder if he thought people, 150 years later, would be sitting around regaling and revering him and telling their children about him. My grandson Luke, any of y'all that are Facebook friends, I'm seeing a few heads nodding, that guy's going to be a dynamo. He's either going to destroy the world or make it a much better place to live. These are the kind of people he is going to know he needs to be like. He's not going to be confused about his binary classification or his gender or his trans this or his LBGQ or whatever that. So, there it is, Stand Watie's grave in the Polson Cemetery, and you have to drive through highway, byway, you've been there, mud, dirt, and gravel to get there, but it is worth the pilgrimage. And I close this up again. Let us now praise famous men and our fathers that begat us. And I thank you.